It is sobering to think that for 2 generations, the law of the land of the United States allowed for separate but equal facilities for black Americans. Drinking fountains, lunch counters, baseball stadiums, roadhouses, hotels in many towns and many states until the middle of this century were segregated with the blessing of the law. How could that have happened? What about the Constitution, which was amended after the Civil War to secure the rights of all Americans? Surely, you might think if segregation were ever tested in court, it would have to have been found unconstitutional. But when the time came, it wasn't. The test, as Martha Teichner reports now in this morning's cover story, came 100 years ago this month.
How many people knew who Homer Plessy was? No? How many people know what Plessy versus Ferguson was? Okay, that's who Homer Plessy was.
He was a man whose name was misappropriated by history. On Greg Osborne's New Orleans cemetery tours, people remember Plessy versus Ferguson, even if they're not sure why.
And it established separate but equal for the whole country.
Ah, yes, the Supreme Court ruling 100 years ago that validated what was to be more than a half-century of segregation. It was the opposite of what Homer Plessy intended.
In 1890, the Louisiana legislature enacted a law that wanted separation of whites and blacks. They wanted separate train cars for whites and black passengers.
The Separate Car Act applied to all Louisiana trains, even streetcars. The cars were supposed to be separate, but equal in quality, which is where Homer Plessy comes in.
So on June 7th, in 1892, Homer Adolph Plessy bought a first-class ticket.
Law professor Charles Ogletree at a re-examination of the Plessy case recently at Harvard University.
He boarded a train in New Orleans. He took a seat with his first-class ticket in a section that had been reserved for whites. He then refused to be moved at the insistence of the conductor.
Historian Greg Osborne.
Here's this man who comes out from nowhere, from the shadow, steps in to be told that, "Are you colored?" And he says, "Yes."
Homer Plessy was removed from the train. The records of his arrest and newspaper accounts of the incident still exist. It was all as carefully orchestrated as any civil rights challenge of the 1960s. A group of wealthy, influential New Orleans blacks who called themselves the Committee of Citizens, accustomed to their post-Civil War freedoms, expected the Separate Car Act would be found unconstitutional.
They were trying to challenge something that was in the country going to happen. Separate churches, separate schools, separate accommodations, separate everything. But he stepped forward to say, well, we need to fight this.
Homer Plessy was chosen to test the law because he looked white. Nobody can find a photograph of him, but relatives say he resembled his cousin Gustav. Ferguson was New Orleans Judge John Ferguson, a segregationist eager to speed the case up the judicial ladder. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled against Plessy 8-1. Justice John Marshall Harlan from Kentucky, once a slaveholder himself, was the one dissenter. What he wrote in his dissenting opinion has shaped racial debate in the United States ever since. He said, quote, "Our Constitution is colorblind. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The law regards man as man." His words were prophetic. The thin disguise of equal accommodations for passengers in railroad coaches will not mislead anyone, nor atone for the wrong this day done.
We'll call the case of Plessy versus Ferguson.
It was with the benefit of hindsight that a distinguished group of legal scholars staged their rehearing of Plessy at Harvard Law School.
Now, why go back?
U.S. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer.
And it is worth making that leap of historical imagination to try to think why. Perhaps for understanding, perhaps so we will not, any of us, in the future, make similar mistakes.
Professor Charles Ogletree argued for Plessy.
The law in this case is suggesting that Mr. Plessy is treated differently, and he submits less well off because he is a Negro. and for no other reason.
Professor Randall Kennedy argued against him.
Your Honor, this is not a racist law. This defendant is able to travel just like his white brothers and sisters.
Professor Kennedy. Not freely. Professor Kennedy.
The irony here, it is likely neither of the lawyers nor most of the judges would have their jobs had Plessy versus Ferguson not been overturned in 1954 by Brown versus Board of Education.
On 13th Amendment grounds, it should be struck.
I would vote to reverse.
And I would now vote to reverse our original position.
But in Homer Plessy's day, there was no such vindication. There was instead segregation, a telling postscript to what happened. In 1922, Homer Plessy allowed his voter registration to read that he was white.
To me, Plessy is a hero. He is a Rosa Parks. He is a civil rights leader. And I think people forget that. They think he was just a light-skinned black man who could pass and use that as a privilege.
Greg Osborne moved to New Orleans to research his family's Creole history and discovered he is related to the Plessys.
I want to know more about him. That's something that I try to do for myself. Who am I? Can you base identity on your ancestors? I think you partly can. Well, he lived next door on that side of this double.
His curiosity about Homer Plessy, where he lived, what happened to him, became a personal search.
I see myself as a family griot. Griot is the African person who records in his mind by memorization all the family lore and tradition.
But in the end, there wasn't much. The fact that he had no children, his jobs as a shoemaker, and eventually an insurance collector. Plessy family members had all heard his story, but it did not bind them together. Most of them had never met before. But Homer Plessy's momentary role in the drama of race relations was important enough that in New Orleans, on the 100th anniversary of the court decision, he was honored. And 100 years after the fact, an extraordinary thing happened. Homer Plessy's act of civil disobedience did bring his family together. In the church where Homer Plessy was married, they gathered, a church built in the 1840s for free blacks.
I am the true vine, you are the branches. But 100 years ago, 9 earthly judges said, take this black branch and put it over there, and put the white branches over here.
It would be easy to say that Homer Plessy would have liked the traditional jazz funeral he was given.
Both of our great-grandmothers were sisters. Okay.
But nobody is too sure what he would have thought. Because the only thing he left behind was his name, indelible in the racial history of the United States.
As we rededicate this tomb, bless all the graves of all the kith and kin of Homer Plessy. May he rest in peace. Amen.